So I used to work as a nurse in a small hospital. Nothing too big, but we'd get our share of emergencies. I was on the night shift one evening, which wasn't unusual. Night shifts can be weird though, because the hospital feels different when it's dark and mostly quiet. There are fewer people around, and sometimes it just feels off. Anyway, that night was pretty slow. Around 2 a.m., I was at the nurse's station with a few coworkers, chatting and trying to stay awake when we got a call about a patient coming in by ambulance. The patient was an elderly woman, brought in for some kind of respiratory issue. We weren't given many details. She arrived unconscious, and they rushed her into one of the rooms. I remember the EMTs looked a bit shaken, but they didn't say much, just handed her off and left pretty quickly, which wasn't usual for them. I didn't think much of it at first, just another patient, right? But when we got her settled into her room, that's when things started feeling weird. The room just felt colder than the rest of the unit, even though the thermostat showed normal. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe the room had bad insulation or something. The woman wasn't responding to anything we were doing. Her vitals were low, but stable enough that we thought we could manage her until morning. I was tasked with keeping an eye on her throughout the night, doing the usual rounds and checking on her every hour. So around 3:30 a.m. I go in to check on her. The room was even colder than before, to the point where I could see my breath. That was strange enough, but then I noticed her heart monitor was beeping slower than it should have been. I looked at the machine. It didn't seem to be malfunctioning, but her heart rate was really slow, like she was barely alive. As I got closer to her bed, I heard this faint whispering sound. At first, I thought maybe it was the TV or something, but it wasn't. The room was silent except for the heart monitor. Then I realized the whispering was coming from the woman. Her mouth was barely moving, just a tiny flutter of her lips, but she was saying something. I leaned in closer, trying to make out what she was whispering. It didn't sound like English or anything I recognized, really. It was this low, raspy murmuring, almost like she was praying or chanting. I asked her if she could hear me, but she didn't react, just kept whispering in that strange way. My whole body was tense. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I stayed with her for a few more minutes, trying to adjust her oxygen and make her comfortable. That's when it happened. I was standing at her bedside when suddenly her hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. This woman had been completely unresponsive since she arrived, but her grip was unbelievably strong. I froze, her eyes opened wide, and she stared directly at me. But here's the thing. Her eyes weren't normal. They were completely black. No pupils, no whites, just solid black like her eyes had filled with ink. She didn't say anything, just stared at me, still holding my wrist in this death grip. I couldn't move, and then she smiled, this slow, unnatural smile that didn't look right on her face. It was almost like her skin was too tight around her mouth, stretching in ways it shouldn't. She leaned in closer, still smiling, and whispered, "He's here." I yanked my arm away and stumbled back, knocking over the IV stand. I ran out of the room, completely freaked out. I told the other nurses what happened, but when we all went back in there a few minutes later, she was gone. No pulse, no signs of life, just dead, like she had been the whole time. Time of death was 3:47 a.m. I didn't tell anyone else about what I saw with her eyes or what she said, because I didn't even know how to explain it without sounding crazy. But here's the part that still gets to me. Later that morning, one of the older nurses pulled me aside. She'd been at that hospital for years and had seen all kinds of things. I didn't even have to say anything to her about what happened. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "You saw him, didn't you?" I asked her what she meant, and she just nodded toward the room where the woman had died. I've seen it a few times now, always with patients like her, right before they go. They see something, they know something, and when they do, he's always close behind. I quit that job a few months later. Too many nights of wondering who or what she was talking about. And I'm not sure I want to know.